It's great to be here. We're joining you from Brooklyn, New York, where we are members of the First Unitarian Congregational Society in downtown Brooklyn. And we were sort of pulled into, as he mentioned, we did write one previous book. It was about the history of rabies. And in the process of researching the history of rabies, we became really fascinated with the 19th century as a sort of era of incredible change, in particular change around animals and how they were regarded, the rise of science, all manner of both kind of humane sentiments around animals, and also the rise of a kind of cruelty at an industrial scale, which really is the subject of this new book, which is called Our Kindred Creatures, How Americans Came to Feel the Way They Do About Animals. We've made some visual aids, and I'm going to try to get those going. Let's see. So you should be able to see that, and I think we're good. So I assume you guys can all see that screen. Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is the time period that we write about in the book, 1866 to 1896, which, begins the year after the Civil War, which is not a coincidence. That's the year of the founding of the ASPCA, and essentially the dawn of the animal welfare movement in this country. And it came, decades later than in England and Europe, where the very first SPCA started in England in the 1820s. The idea sort of percolated around Europe in the 30s and 40s and 50s. There were whole humane congresses of organizations in Europe in the 1850s, but because all of the energy in this country around sort of urgent progressive reform was focused on the issue of abolition. It takes until 1866 for the movement to arrive here, and we're going to talk about some of the figures who were part of that movement and who we write about in the book, and many of them had connections to Unitarianism and Universalism, but sort of taking a step back, the point that we make in the book is that this really is the era when you begin to see our contemporary complex of attitudes towards animals developing. And we mean that kind of in every sense. The rise of a real love for our pets, begins to happen during this era. You do have the rise of the anti-cruelty movement, which does make really profound changes in how animals are regarded in laws and in norms. But you also begin to see the sense of animals, especially food animals, as kind of distant from human society in a way that I think challenges our moral sense. And I think part of the great kind of unfinished quality of the revolution for animals, for kindness to animals in this country, is really tied up in that distance that essentially the rise of factory meat production, factory egg production, that happens during this time period as well. Before we start to talk about some of the figures in the book and some of the ideas that they're steeped in, we want to talk about what life really was like in 1866. This is a very whimsical illustration by Currier and Ives that sort of shows a vision of just how, in this case of the horse, of just what it was like to live in a late 19th century city.
This illustration depicts New York City, and as you can see, there are horses everywhere because at this time, even though we're well into the Industrial Revolution, horses were still sort of the prime movers in US cities. And that means not only were they pulling carriages full of sort of private households, but mass transit was horse-driven, both as horse-drawn buses, which would sort of zigzag down the street, picking up people, and horse-drawn rail cars, which could actually put a whole lot of people on wheels, pulled by a small team of horses or a single horse. Freight on city streets was also pulled mostly by horses, although occasionally by other livestock or dogs. And even though this was the age of the railroads and the steamship, all the coal that fed those steam engines was brought by horses. So horses were essential to movement in this society. And even urban dwellers really were constantly seeing not only horses, but also other livestock, because the era before refrigeration, of course, meant that animals who were killed for meat had to be brought very close to population centers, or actually into them, sort of herded off of ships and railroads and through the streets to slaughter facilities. Um, the There were also, for a long time, sort of persistent stock in sort of private residential areas. So you might have an apartment building with a milk cow in the courtyard, or some goats or a few pigs. The official rules in New York City and many other cities of the time were that pigs couldn't sort of roam at large, but this was at least some of the time ignored. And meanwhile, dogs and cats were very much given their freedom, even if they were somebody's pet, full-time or part-time. They had liberty to roam the streets at least some of the day. So we have just a lot of animals living in the midst of urban city dwellers. So even though there's this massive movement from the countryside into US cities, that doesn't mean people are moving away from animals. The number of horses, for example, this is kind of backtracking. I should have mentioned the number of horses in US cities actually didn't peak until the 20th century. So it was a really big deal.
So with that, I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about the kind of intellectual and really, sort of spiritual origins of the movement on behalf of animals, which, as I said, really comes out of England. The and that really, in the same sense that we talk about a romantic era in literature and other modes of culture, we also, scholars of religion also sort of talk about romanticism as a religious movement. And the fundamental shift, and this really, you really see this happen in the 18th century, in the 1700s, is this sense that begins to happen in the pulpit that the individual joys and sorrows of human beings are worthy of God's consideration. This wasn't something that was taken for granted in the medieval era. It was not necessarily something that you would have had ministers kind of take as their as their kind of starting point from to when they preached. And so, there's a famous quote from John Wesley from 1791. Benevolence and compassion toward all forms of human woe have increased in a manner not known before from the earliest ages of the world. And Wesley was one of the figures very associated with this movement. There's a quote from a sort of conservative enemy of this kind of romantic turn in the pulpit, complaining that imagination may be indulged until it usurps an entire ascendancy over the mind, and then every subject presented to that mind will excite imagination instead of understanding. And partly what I like about this quote from an enemy of the romantic turn is this invocation of the world imagination is very important. Even in the human context, the kinds of suffering that people were beginning to awaken to and beginning to say, hey, this is a subject of God's great concern, and therefore needs to be a subject of our concern, were often things that had to be imagined. People began to imagine the suffering of enslaved people. people began to imagine the suffering and imagine it very keenly and really sort of put themselves in that position. People began to really imagine the suffering of the poor. Of course, you have the rise of, the slow rise of the novel sort of happening during this time period, and those two things mingled together. But first, I wanted to mention this book from the Reverend Humphrey Primmett in 1776. This is often seen as the kind of very first text of the animal welfare movement. And he says, our love and mercy are not to be confined within the circle of our own friends, acquaintance, and neighbors, nor limited to the enlarged sphere of human beings to creatures of our own rank, shape, and capacity, but are extended to every object of love and mercy of God, the universal parent. And this sense that, hey, love and mercy are a quality of all God's creation, and therefore we need to extend our love and mercy as humans to everything. And this also, you'll notice that the metaphor of the circle, if any of you are fans of Peter Singer, his book, The Expanding Circle, that this metaphor really, whether consciously or unconsciously, gets picked up, of the sense of we can sort of imagine our way, sort of feel our way to caring about beings that aren't necessarily connected to us. They aren't even necessarily like us. That really is the essence of the romantic turn. As I said, you sort of have the social novel during this period, which becomes incredibly influential. Oliver Twist is often sort of forgotten just how directly Dickens was responding to, kind of cruel public policy changes of his era, trying to illustrate how reprehensible they were. And then in our own country, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is just a total sensation and really goes a long way to galvanizing readers around the country on that issue. Wait for my next slide. Of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous brother, Henry Ward Beecher, is, they're raised in a more conservative religious environment, but by the 1850s, 1860s, Henry Ward Beecher is, the most famous preacher in the country. And he himself has really taken this romantic turn. It's something you see sort of during the arc of his own intellectual life. We especially like this quote because it's from a speech he gave to the American Veterinary College, which was one of the first veterinary colleges in the country. If you want to read this one.
This is an age of humanity. Men are sensitive to suffering as they never were before. Cruel laws are passing away, and even cruelty in slaughtering animals is discountenanced. Do not let any man look down on you because he ministers to mankind while you minister to suffering brutes.
And so this is really, this I think really is, to our mind, kind of the spiritual dimension of kind of why there was such a fertile ground for these changes, and also why, on the heels of abolitionism in this country, you have a lot of that energy flowing into these other causes, including women's suffrage, including, well, there are a number of them, but animal welfare being one of them. So to talk about some of the figures, first and foremost is Henry Bergh, the founder of the ASPCA.
So Henry Bergh was a New Yorker, son of a shipbuilder and wealthy all his life. He spent the most of his adult life up and through his 40s without much occupation. You could call him a dilettante. He traveled widely, and ultimately, during the Lincoln administration, he found a post as part of the diplomatic corps of Russia. During his travels, he had two key sort of conversion experiences that woke him up to animal suffering and sort of brought him on board the cause of animal welfare. The first was in Spain. He watched a bullfight and was disgusted not only by the action in the ring, where horses and bulls were both grievously wounded and killed, but also just all around him in the stands. The fact that people were taking delight in this really disgusted him. When he was in Russia, dressed in a fancy diplomatic uniform, he jumped out of the carriage to intervene when he saw someone brutally punishing a horse. The driver he confronted immediately stopped what he was doing, was completely cowed, and it sort of woke Bergh up to the way he could make a difference, a real sort of meaningful difference, horse by horse. But of course, he wasn't satisfied with that, so he undertakes to start a movement. He does spend time in London on his way back to the States to sort of learn at the side of the Royal ASPCA or Royal SPCA there, and sort of following their playbook, came back to New York and started an organization here, the first in the country. He, within several months of his arrival back in New York City, had circulated a petition to a lot of the important people of the city, bringing them on board for the creation of SPCA. He had had a charter for said organization passed up in Albany, and animal welfare laws to protect animals passed there as well. And he got enforcement powers for his new organization to actually take to the streets and start bringing people to justice for abuse of animals. So it happened very, very fast, and it led to meaningful changes in the way people treated animals in his city and elsewhere, because he did quickly learn to sort of leverage celebrity for the cause of animals. He really believed in the sort of all publicity is good publicity type of thinking, and made spectacle wherever he could, and enjoyed being in the newspapers. And he'd rather sort of be written about harshly or comically than not be written about at all. And so he was not just New York news, but national news. People all over the country followed his exploits on behalf of animals. Sorry. No, that didn't do it. Here we go. So here he is confronting a driver who is attempting to drive a rail car with sick horses, pulling a large group of people on a heavily burdened car. This actual event takes place during the horse flu in 1872, which was a sort of shocking epizootic, which is to say sort of an epidemic of influenza that struck animals, not people. It put nearly all horses in North America off of work, city by city by city, so that cities, instead of teeming with horse life, like in the picture you saw earlier, were completely shut down as all the animals in the city very quickly fell ill. His efforts like this, though, weren't limited to during horse flu. He would intervene when he saw horses being worked hard in bad weather conditions, or with a limp, or just beaten or otherwise mistreated. His focus was horses, but he also would chase down carts full of food animals on their way to market if he didn't think they were being shipped in an appropriate fashion. He intervened on behalf of dogs and cats and other animals, including turtles. The thing about Henry Bergh was he really, really loved prosecuting cases, bringing cruelists, as he called them, to justice. So he had a real law enforcement zeal, and was a fan of significant punishment for people who hurt animals, especially hurt animals in public, because he believed that it was morally degrading, not only for the people carrying out animal abuse, but for people who witnessed animal abuse, that such things were happening sort of before everybody's eyes. So And here is a horse being loaded into a horse ambulance, which he invented. The horse ambulance came into use in New York City before human ambulances came into use in New York City, which is kind of fun. And by sort of waking people up to animal suffering, he woke them up to all kinds of suffering, which as we go into more in our book, actually sort of happened hand in hand with the introduction of scientific veterinary medicine in this country, because of course, once you're worried about how animals feel and suffer, you also have an increased interest in making them feel better. So that's Henry Bergh.
So another big figure in the book is Carolyn Earl White, and she was the founder. Should be considered the founder of the Pennsylvania SPCA. She put the real energy into starting it up. At the time, this was 1868, so it was one of the first three that was founded in the country. It was not seen as socially acceptable for women to be the heads of these kinds of even progressive organizations. And that changes over the course of our time period. She also was the founder of the American Anti-Vivisection Society. And by then, there was no real social issue with her kind of being the main leader of that. And she was raised in the First Unitarian Church in Philadelphia. Her family had not been Unitarians. They were Quakers in the Hicksite strain. I'm not sure if you saw the cover of our book was by one of the Peaceable Kingdom paintings by the sign painter Edward Hicks. And his brother, Elias Hicks, was the sort of the spiritual leader of what became a kind of splinter sect of Quakers. They were more abolitionist, vehemently abolitionist, and they also had this radical idea about this sort of inner light, the idea that human beings had the capacity to kind of access a deep moral truths that really exceeded the authority of not just preachers, but even scripture itself, which was very, very controversial. When the scriptures have directed and pointed us to this light within, there they must stop. It is their ultimatum, the top stone of what they can do. It was a similar line of thinking in Lucretia Mott, the work of Lucretia Mott, who was Carolyn Earl White's cousin. It was her mother's, I think maybe first cousin. I can't remember exactly the relationship, but relatively close cousin. For those of you who don't know, Lucretia Mott became a very, very famous abolitionist lecturer. She was one of a number of speakers, and one of a number of women speakers who traveled the country with sort of fiery oratory against slavery. And she said, no text of scripture, however plain, can shake thy belief in a truth which thou perceives by intuition, and make thee believe a thing which is contrary to thy innate sense of right and wrong. Now, funnily enough, Carolyn White did ultimately, and this was largely because of marriage. She fell in love with an Irish immigrant who had been raised Catholic, and after a period of great questioning and grappling, she converted to Catholicism and made a reasonable point about the virtue of having a little bit of authority in your religion. She said, "It seemed to me that Almighty God would never allow his children in so important a matter as religion to wander in the dark without a clear explanation of his doctrine and the laws by which he intended that we should govern our conduct." So it's sort of an interesting dimension of her journey, that she sort of veers from what at the time, in Hicksite Quakerism and even Unitarianism was kind of at the farthest reaches of kind of rejecting intermediaries between human God and his people, gravitated towards the sort of the other end of the spectrum. But Carolyn Earl White was a really major figure in the animal welfare issues of the day on a number of dimensions. As I said, she eventually founds the American Anti-Vivisection Society, like really leads the way in this country in trying to raise awareness of cruel practices in scientific research. But maybe the sort of greatest legacy of her activism was, I'm not asking you to read this, but the sort of the founding of the very first humane animal shelter in this country. I'll just tell you a little bit about what's in this text from the New York Times. At the time, the dog pounds, kind of all around the country were very brutal places. They killed the animals in very cruel ways, and the women of the Pennsylvania SPCA resolved that they were going to start a humane shelter, and they did, and they allowed the animals to stay longer, and they did practice euthanasia, but they were really the first group of people in this country to research humane euthanasia methods, and were sort of, got the latest intel from Europe about what the best methods were. So moving on, the third kind of big founding figure of the animal welfare movement, George Thorndike Angell, who founded the Massachusetts SPCA. It's not really clear as an adult. He wrote a lot about God. Rhetorically, it's not totally clear that he was a churchgoer. He was the son of a Baptist preacher who died when he was very young, and when he became very galvanized about George Angell became very galvanized about the animal issue before there was a movement, and in fact put a provision in his will in 1864, before the ASPCA had started, that basically said that whatever money he had that had not gone to his heir should go into a fund for humane education on behalf of animals, and that really was his passion. He started a magazine through the MSPCA, which is a sort of comical name today of Our Dumb Animals. But this was a very sort of profound point that a lot of the animal activists made of this era, that animals uniquely among the objects of our concern are unable to advocate for themselves, and so we need to advocate on their behalf. And this publication was also very innovative in the way that it used poetry and fiction, original essays, sort of quote, excerpts of other people's essays, in really trying to reach families. The target audience of Our Dumb Animals became, mothers and children. And children in general were a big preoccupation of Angell. He was the engine of something called the Band of Mercy, which was this fascinating project in the late 19th century where children were encouraged to start up clubs in their schools that they would lead themselves, that were all about kindness to animals, and they would give them a little badge, and they would encourage them to do readings together. They would have little songs that they could sing, but the idea being, hey, let's reach children and make them feel a sort of individual responsibility. And then Angell was also really the person who was responsible for the international success of Black Beauty. Black Beauty had been published in 1877, was reasonably successful in England, but had never been published in the United States. And 13 years later, in 1890, somebody gives a copy of it to George Angell, and he immediately says, this is what I've been looking for. You might see at the bottom of the title page on the left, it says The Uncle Tom's Cabin of the Horse. George Angell had thought for decades that he was looking for a novel that would do for the cause of cruelty to horses what Uncle Tom's Cabin had done for the cause of slavery, and felt that he had finally found it. And on the right, you can see the title page in Italian, and it wasn't just Italian, through this sort of sensation that he created around the book 13 years after its publication. It was translated into a host of other languages and really took off. And in fact, sold more copies in its first year than Uncle Tom's Cabin did, which had famously been the sort of best-selling book other than the Bible on its publication in the 1850s. And sort of again to sort of come back to the subject of imagination, which is in some ways the theme of this talk, is the sense that we have to imagine our way into the animal perspective, and that's what George Angel, I think, really more than the other animal activists of the era, really saw that and put all sorts of energy into trying to sort of activate the imagination of people around him. And then
a few words about P.T. Barnum. We, along with the activists we follow in our book, we also do follow some of the problematic figures of the era who, committed sort of bad acts against animals and often were the sort of foils to our activist group. And P.T. Barnum is my favorite bad guy in our book. Perhaps it's too simple to call him a bad guy, really. I mean, he's a bad guy as far as his animals were concerned, but P.T. Barnum, who was spent a lot of time in New York and also Bridgeport, Connecticut, he was like these other people, part of a progressive religious tradition. Although he was brought up Congregationalist, he really rejected that fire and brimstone type of religion in favor of universal salvation. And he, in his teens, I think, started thinking of himself as a Universalist, although he didn't formally join a church until decades later. And he was a longtime member of the First Universalist Church in Bridgeport. He was a showman, and in sort of, he had some traveling acts initially, and then he established Barnum's American Museum in downtown Manhattan, which was the major tourist attraction of its era. It really was a big undertaking, and it put live animal displays right alongside taxidermy and other sort of natural history and weird hoaxes and wax museum stuff, and really was, he thought of it as edifying educational entertainment for families, although anyone who would pay a quarter, he was happy to have them come in. On the left you see a playbill from the American Museum, and this playbill includes an advertisement for a beluga whale exhibit. He did bring beluga whales to New York City, for the first person to exhibit them, and a whole bunch of other species. He was the first to exhibit in New York City. The belugas were a pretty big effort and investment. He had to arrange their live capture up in Labrador. He actually went up there for that. And then their transport by specially outfitted rail car down into New York, stopping along the way for sort of a on the road exhibit, getting lots of publicity for the American Museum on the way. When he advertised the whales to New Yorkers, I'm not sure it says so here, but some of his other advertising materials explicitly say, like, come see them soon. They're not going to be here long, because try as he might, he was not able to keep these whales alive very long. He did constantly innovate, trying to improve the husbandry of the animals in his care, if for no other reason than these animals cost him a lot of money, and he wanted to see good returns on his investment. But the whales were particularly problematic, and his initial efforts, especially to exhibit them in a tank in the basement of the museum, produced only a few days of display, long enough for them to make back what he invested. But he got better a little bit as he went along. On the right is an advertisement for Jumbo, which he exhibited Jumbo decades later during his circus days, traveling circus by railway, I think is what he's remembered for most at this point. And Jumbo was his most famous exhibit. Jumbo was extracted from Africa, and which likely involved the wholesale slaughter of his herd. He was exhibited first in London and then transported to the United States amid great fanfare. And then he went from city to city as part of the Barnum and Bailey and other partners circus. He did with all these exhibits, he really imbued these animals with a lot of personality. It was part of how he promoted them. He'd tell stories about them, some more fanciful than others, and really try to excite people's imagination about these individual animals and want to see them in particular. And in that way, he did on some level, increase people's emotional investment in animals, especially wildlife that lived at some distance from New Yorkers and other American city dwellers and small town dwellers, because these circuses, of course, traveled very widely. And he wasn't entirely, he wouldn't have described himself as against animal welfare at all. He was actually on the board of the Bridgeport SPCA, and we often describe his relationship to Henry Bergh as one of frenemies. They both loved publicity and they enjoyed public spats. Barnum wasn't always on the wrong side of some of these issues either, because sometimes they revolved around animal husbandry, and he actually knew more than Bergh did often about what was best for the animals in his care. Not these animals. This is an exhibit he put on called The Happy Family at the American Museum, and it consisted of a multi-species enclosure, including both predators and prey. And he advertised it as, sort of the peaceable kingdom come to life, that these animals live together in harmony, and it's a sort of glimpse of paradise on earth. You should come see it. In point of fact, contemporary observers said there were frequent spats between the animals, eruptions of violence, and sometimes they had to be broken up by an attendant with a stick. But this was a fixture of the American Museum for many years. It was written about for years afterwards as something that people fondly remembered when the museums burned down. And they did burn down with all these animals inside. So,
and I think, in some ways, I feel like it kind of brings us full circle, right? In that the impulse that he had to present the kingdom of animals as a happy family is sort of part of this sense of, wanting to imagine kind of animal harmony and the harmony of humans and animals, even as he wasn't really living up to that in terms of
right.
how he treated them.
Yes, behind the scenes, the fantasy didn't really hold up. Yeah.
So there are many more of these sorts of characters in the book, and we'd love to open it up to questions. I sort of put up this quote, which again, some of you, if you know the Peter Singer book, The Expanding Circle, this is the epigraph to the book. Kind of another version of the point that John Wesley made about human sort of increasing human compassion. But this is the Irish historian William Lecky writing about this process whereby human affections are able to expand, at one time embracing merely the family, but soon a class, then a nation, then a coalition of nations, then all humanity, and finally its influence is felt in the dealings of man with the animal world. I think the question that we think about in thinking about the legacy of this era and kind of how it's germane to our present day is, in what new ways do we need to reimagine the circle in order to open it more? And with that, I will stop sharing, and we would love to answer any questions that people might have.
Okay, so thank you so much. That was fascinating. I knew a little bit about this, but it's wonderful to hear such rich detail and your perspectives on the movements. The way we're going to handle questions and answers is if you can use the raise hand feature of Zoom, that button, or if you don't see that, you can just raise your hand like this, and Zoom should recognize that you're raising your hand, or I'll be looking through and I will call on you. So who has the first question? Of course, you have to have your camera on for Zoom to recognize that you're raising your hand. Dave and Eileen Steele.
Yes, thanks very much for your presentation and for your work. I have a number of thoughts that have been provoked by what you've had to say in describing your book and in thinking about the eras that have followed the era that you're looking at. One is, did anybody in the era in which you are writing about challenge the notion of animals as property? I believe that the fact that in our legal system animals are property it plays a significant role in the problems that we face today with abuse and neglect of animals and the inhumane conditions in which farm animals in factory farming operations are treated. So did anybody ever challenge that notion that that animals were humankind's property?
No, this is very much an era of animal welfare movement starting up. The animal rights organization, sort of as we understand it today, wouldn't start for maybe a century, almost.
Yeah, but I think it also speaks to, I do think that their horizons for what was possible and sort of how radically to rethink the relationship between humans and animals were definitely limited, which is, I think, part of the reason why I think people from our era can sometimes be frustrated with this early era of animal reformers. I mean, in some ways, the most dramatic example of that is there was a vegetarian movement during this time period, but it really wasn't focused on animal cruelty or suffering. And to our knowledge, it was human health. And to our knowledge, none of the animal activists who we write about in this book embrace vegetarianism or really went as far as to think, hey, if I really love animals, then we shouldn't be.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just want to bring you back to that image of the horses in New York City. I mean, that's how all American cities looked at that time. And as everyone sort of realized with the start during the horse flu, the economy depended utterly on owned animals, working animals, and it's not a huge failure of their imagination that they couldn't see a world past this, because it really was on that level a different time. I mean, it wasn't seen as optional.
Yeah, I didn't mean by my question to be, I wasn't criticizing people of that era. I was just wondering if that was an idea that began to circulate at any time. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Not that we saw.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you want to ask a question?
You're still. Oh, Eileen, go ahead.
Are you considering writing a book about the animal rights movement?
We have a lot of book ideas so in mind, but I guess I don't. I think a lot of people are writing about the animal rights movement, and which is wonderful. But I think that we have this interest in history that kind of takes us further back often, and I don't know.
Yeah, in some ways, I think, part of what really interested us about this era were all the things that they didn't see, and also just the way in which, the cliche is the past is another country, and you really feel like the past is another country when you think about the ways that humans and animals interacted in these era, sort of before machines kind of took over all of what horses were doing, and also in an era before rabies vaccination, before kitty litter, before a lot of the ways that we have kind of domesticated our relationships with the animals that are still around us didn't exist, and so there was something just much less governable about the relationship between humans and animals, and it made for a really fascinating, immersing ourselves in that world was just so interesting.
Other questions? Well, while people are working their courage up, I will ask. I would be curious to hear anything more that you might have to say about Humphrey Primat's text and how the way that he approached animal welfare in that very early treatise differs from how we might think of it today. And then I also would be very interested to hear more about the story of Henry Bergh and the intervention in Russia when he saw the horse being beaten. I had been aware of that story of him seeing a horse being beaten, but I hadn't recalled that he actually intervened. So I'd love to hear anything more you could share about that incident.
Sure. Well, I'll talk about Humphrey Primat, and you could talk about Bergh. But so what. So one of the things that I think is very interesting about that book, and it's you can find it on Google Books. It has a very kind of 1776 sort of quality to it, in that it's pretty old fashioned in how it's written. I definitely, this idea of the circle and the fact that metaphor continues to get picked up was one thing about it that I think was interesting. I mean, to be frank, like I think one of the things that was remarkable about it was just that it was an entire book about animals. And I do think, I honestly think this is true today, that one of the barriers to activism on behalf of animals is the idea that we're going to put animals at the center of a campaign for something, when it's always possible to say, well, these people are suffering, those people are suffering, which is always a fair point to make. And the idea that he took the trouble to write a whole book that was just about the obligation to animals, I do think was kind of radical in and of itself, and partly why it stands the way that it did. People had mentioned before that animals should be were blessed in the sight of God, or what have you. But giving a whole book over to it. Then the other two things I'd quickly mention is he does in 1776, at the point before abolition is achieved in the UK, that takes longer, but mentions the sort of analogy to slavery and to sort of racial forms of oppression as an analog for why we also cannot be wantonly cruel to animals. And that, of course, proves to really be an inescapable analogy that, and over there as well, a lot of the same people become involved in the animal welfare crusade, notably William Wilberforce, the evangelical parliamentarian who is instrumental in both campaigns. And then the last thing that I would say is that, we're still in 1776, we're still, I don't know, 70 years before Darwin. But, it didn't take Darwin to make people understand that animals and humans were built very similarly, right? Like down at the level of our organs, the nervous system, the sense that And of course, you have a Christian religion that says that God made man in his own image. Well, if that's the case, then here you have these animals that demonstrably possess the sort of same physiology. And so, the great taxonomizers of the 1700s, Linnaeus and so on, had already perceived that you had to put humans and animals in the same lineage. And this was a point that Humphrey Primmett made, saying, God has endowed animals with the same organs, the same sensation and so on, that they must therefore suffer in the same way. And that argument is really picked up a few decades later when the very first animal welfare anti-cruelty bills are brought in Parliament. A lot of the same arguments are essentially repeated word for word, and that's also a very important aspect of that book. Do we want?
So what we know about that incident in Russia is what Henry Bergh has decided to tell us. Pretty much, he told this story in speeches, sort of throughout his career in animal welfare. He described the sort of jumping from the carriage to intervene as somewhat spontaneous. He always makes note of the fact that he was wearing this impressive uniform with gold lace. And I think in his telling the story, which was probably designed for some humor, it may have been the uniform, the splendor of the uniform, rather than anything really compelling about how he presented himself. That stopped the droshky driver from beating the horse. He usually told this anecdote in combination with describing his first arrest in New York City, right after he got his animal legislation passed and returned from Albany. He went out the same night in top hat and his fancy dress, and he stopped a driver who was beating a horse in the streets, hoping for the same result. And the American driver would have none of it. Like he didn't sort of cower the way the droshky driver did, in respect of his obvious social position. He yelled at him, he told him off, he cussed him out, and the first arrest didn't really succeed. I think he describes then sort of going back to the drawing board about how he's actually going to carry out arrests, usually with the cooperation of the police on the street, to actually ensure that he got compliance from the animal abusers. So it is it's a funny story in his telling, although Bergh's a prickly character. I kind of breezed by the fact that he was Unitarian and he went to All Souls Church in Manhattan. He got the minister there involved in the cause as well. But it's hard to look at his life and really, like, as a contemporary Unitarian, and see the Unitarian sensibility, of the love for humanity, that we all strive for. I mean, he really seemed to dislike cruel people more than he loved the elevation of good behavior and kindness to animals and the animals themselves. He didn't really seem to have any sentimentality there. And on some level, I was sort of contrasting him with Barnum. I mean, those two are pretty fun to read about side by side, because Barnum, who exploited animals and people in ways that we find reprehensible. I mean, he was kind of a nice guy, like, it's fun. I mean, nice. It's fun to read him. He really does seem to have a big heart and to sort of care about humanity, in at least in how he presents himself in his writing. So it's complicated.
Thank you. That's really illuminating. Before I go to Clarence and then Robert, I want to note that we're talking about having a book discussion group for UUAM supporters. And if we can get enough critical mass of people to participate, then I am hoping we could entice Bill and Monica to be part of it. So if you are possibly interested, please either put your email in the chat. You can direct the chat just to me instead of everyone and put your email address, or you can send your email to info@uuam.org, and I'll put those instructions in the chat as well. Clarence, what's your question?
Thank you. I just wanted to say first, the authors, I certainly appreciate you putting together a book on a subject like this. I'm sure you've studied the subject long enough to begin to be at least aware of the immensity of this subject, especially as you expanded beyond America to not only 19th century Europe's perceptions of animals and their plight, but just the general concept of the Romantic movement, Romantic poets beginning to mention in all sorts of ways about the inherent significance of animals. And it gets picked up, of course, in the United States by other American romantics like Walt Whitman. And but at any rate, I've been sort of studying this subject for many years, probably 30 or 40 years. And I came at it originally from an animal rights sort of background, and pondering about how not only America, but the world in general has come to this view of animals, and I actually feel like it goes all the way back to Aristotle and his classification system of where he puts of how in an attempt to understand what was going on in nature, he, by way of classifying similar creatures, he also created a system that segregated animals and their humans' perceptions of animals into a system of creatures other than us, other than humans. And that in turn gets picked up, I think, in the Middle Ages by something that was known as the Great Chain of Being or the Great Chain of Existence, in which there's a whole hierarchy of creatures with angels and God at the top, works its way down to angels and sub-angels into humans, and of course kings and other divine of other royalty being above the working classes, and so we're all the way down to rocks and so. But that sort of perception of animals as being beneath humans still exists. I think still exists today. Why people don't realize that, but that's how they perceive of animals is somehow humans are, and the concerns of humans and the welfare of humans is inherently or intrinsically of greater concern than that of animals. So I don't want to take up the group's time with this, but except to suggest that it's a badly needed subject for consideration and has been increasingly so in the last 20 or 30 years with people like Peter Singer and many other souls that come to it from a philosophic sort of angle. But congratulations once again for taking up a particular aspect of this large issue, and that's how it impacted America.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's go to Robert.
Hi, I was interested in the in your description of Bergh's two conversion experiences, and particularly the one in Spain. Apparently, he was disgusted by what was going on in the ring and by the people watching. And I wondered how much of an argument in the 19th century Bergh and others made of the coarsening effect on humans and human morality of cruelty to animals. It's just not that it was a bad thing for the animals. It was a bad thing for the people inflicting the cruelty and those witnessing it. An argument that I've heard recently made about factory farming and slaughterhouses, that part of the cruelty of a slaughterhouse is not just what happens to animals, it's what happens to the people in the slaughterhouse and then what they carry out of that slaughterhouse into the rest of their lives. So it's that part of the argument or not so much?
Oh, absolutely.
In fact, that was really Bergh's big kind of idea was what he called cruelism.
Cruelism.
Oh,
he found that to just be morally degrading across the board, like you said, not only for the people carrying out the cruelty, but for people witnessing it. It was thought to be especially deleterious for children observing cruelty, because they were still morally developing. And you know, because that idea of fighting cruelism was so much at the center of many of these early SPCAs, the one that were sort of drawn up more in Bergh's model than Angel's model of humane education. I do think that the legacy of that is partly to blame for the way that factory farming now is sort of set to one side, because many of these early activists weren't really mobilized by fighting against industrial agriculture, even though they were somewhat aware of the cruelties perpetuated in Chicago and some of the big stockyards in the Midwest, because these were now outside of public view. Children, you know, weren't just encountering it on their way to school the way they were when there were slaughter yards in the cities, in the you know, East Coast of the United States and other urban centers. And so these issues kind of slid away in favor of the ones that sort of played out on the sort of stage of the city streets.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right that you do sometimes hear in the present day, you know, concern about the deleterious effect of the cruelty on the workers who are forced to carry it out. But generally speaking, you know, I think it's been a challenge for these organizations to kind of not just to galvanize themselves, but I think also to sort of galvanize the average person about, you know, the connection between decisions that we make about what we consume and the treatment of some animals sort of very, very far off, kind of both literally and metaphorically from our daily life. And that really does in some ways seem like the biggest ongoing challenge, is that problem of distance, you know, that problem, and which is again a problem of imagination, a problem of you know, something that if it were happening in our neighbor's backyard at our window, you know, we would be outraged about. But because it's happening, you know, behind closed doors, thousands of miles away, it can be harder to galvanize people on the issue.
Any other questions? Any final comments that you would like to make, Bill and Monica?
No, just we've loved talking to you all today, and it's especially exciting. I mean, Reverend John mentioned this sort of thinking about animals in the context of the new UU principles, but also sort of around the climate issue, and around the sense that, you know, we need to be thinking beyond just the human perspective in you know, how we conceive of our sort of circle, so to speak. I'd like to believe that this is a time when UUs and other people can find a way to get more galvanized on these issues, and thinking about how to do that and how best to act on these issues. I don't know, it feels like that the moment is ripe for that, and so we're really interested in being a part of that conversation.
I couldn't agree more. I see some people clapping. I'll add my clapping to the group here. Thank you so much for writing the book. It's wonderful. I haven't read the whole book. I've read part of it, and it's a wonderful book. I encourage everyone to go pick up a copy, whether you're interested in being part of the book discussion or not. It's a wonderful contribution, and I really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today and share your well-earned insights. Thank you, Bill and Monica.
All right. Yeah, have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
And thank you, John, for hosting this. Oh, it's too late.
Oh, of course. Happy to.